Hello, welcome to another edition of Fouts Forum. This is your Mayor, Jim Fouts, and today we're going to look back at 50 years ago on November 22nd, 1963, which, if I can borrow a phrase from Franklin D. Roosevelt about Pearl Harbor, this is a date which will forever be permanently fixed in all of our minds for those of us who can remember back to 50 years ago. The date really involved the first time that I think television became an important medium. It was a time when we had a shared experience and shared grief, and of course that shared experience and shared grief were about the sudden assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And I would say this situation was similar to what happened to our parents dealing with Pearl Harbor, or what happened to some of you later when 9/11 occurred, when Ronald Reagan had an assassination attempt on him, the Challenger, and of course the most important event since the assassination of John Kennedy, 9/11. It is permanently fixed in our mind. Now, I want to talk a little bit about John Kennedy. He ran in one of the closest elections in the history of the United States in 1960 against another young man by the name of Richard Nixon. And both John Kennedy and Richard Nixon were in their 40s. Either one would have become one of the youngest presidents in the United States and the first one born in that century, which was the 20th century or the 1900s. They both would have been the first World War II vets. In fact, Kennedy became the first World War II vet elected. It was a change election because we elected the first Catholic president, and then that was an issue. Hard to believe that religion was an issue back then. It also was the election that we had the first presidential debates since Lincoln-Douglas, and it was the first presidential debate to be on television, and there were 3 debates. Some people say that that presidential debate elected Kennedy because since it was one of the closest elections in history, there were 70 million votes cast. Nixon got 35 million and some, and Kennedy got 35 million and some, and there was only a difference of 100,000 votes, which was smaller than, I think, 0.1 or 2% of the nation. Had Kennedy not done good on the presidential debate, he might not have won the election. And by the way, there was a poll taken by a radio audience and television audience. The radio audience said that Nixon won the debate. The television audience said that Kennedy won the debate. Why did Kennedy win the debate? Well, among other things, he dressed better. He had a dark, sharp suit. Nixon had a gray suit. He wore makeup. Nixon refused to wear makeup. Nixon was sweating, and he had been sick the night before, and Kennedy had a suntan, and he looked very healthy and vigorous. Now, 50 years ago, in 1963, I remember Friday, November 22nd, 1963, like it happened yesterday, and I'm sure our guests would agree to that. In 1963, on Friday, the 22nd, it was a dark, gloomy day. It was rainy, it was cold, it was windy, and all of a sudden, I get a phone call from a friend of mine who said that school has been canceled today, and I said, why? And he said, they shot and killed the president. And I said, I can't believe they shot and killed the president. And he said, turn on the radio, turn on the television. And sure enough, when I turned on the radio, they were talking about it. And when I turned on television, there was Walter Cronkite announcing that the president had been shot, and then later announcing that the president was dead. And I remember Walter Cronkite took off his glasses, he choked up, he fought back tears as he said, President Kennedy is dead. This is a date which will always live permanently in the minds of anybody who can remember back that far. And it was 4 days in which my younger sister and I and my family were transfixed to the television, and I remember that everything began to be closed down. Everything came to a halt, including, of all things, the University of Michigan-Ohio State game. It was scheduled to be played on November 23rd, and Governor George Romney contacted the Chancellor of Ohio State and I believe the President of University of Michigan and asked both of them to cancel the game out of respect so that people could take time to mourn President Kennedy, and they both agreed. So they canceled the game until November 30th, a week later. The first time that I'm aware of, and the only time that the Ohio State-Michigan game was canceled. It's interesting to note that the coaches in that game were Woody Hayes of Ohio State, Bump Elliott of Michigan, and the assistant coach was another Fouts, Jack Fouts. The following day, we all remember, those of us that remember, I got up and it was Saturday morning and we were watching television, and they said the accused assassin of President Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald, is going to be escorted out from where he was held in Texas. And you saw Oswald coming forward. This was live on NBC television. And then all of a sudden, a man in a hat, a burly man, walked up, knocked the reporters over, and shot Oswald. Now, our guest today is Dr. Werner Spitz. Dr. Spitz, welcome to Fouts Forum. And I'm very honored, and it's a great privilege to have what Tracy Perry, the producer of this program, said is clearly the single most important individual that I have interviewed, that we have interviewed in this process. Now, I'd like to give you a background about Dr. Spitz. He is a forensic pathologist. He has practiced forensic pathology for over 50 years. He has lectured and given expert testimony worldwide and has performed or supervised approximately 60,000 autopsies. He is currently a consultant for forensic pathology and toxicology. He is a professor of pathology at Wayne State University School of Medicine. He's an adjunct professor of toxicology at the University of Windsor, Ontario, Canada. He previously was the chief medical examiner at Wayne County, Detroit, Michigan from 1972 to 1988. He was a forensic pathologist and then chief medical examiner for Macomb County from 1972 to 2004. He was the deputy chief medical examiner for the state of Maryland. He was an associate professor at the University of Maryland School of Medicine and Johns Hopkins University. He was involved in the Department of Legal Medicine at the University School of Medicine, West Berlin, Germany. He is certified by the American Board of Pathology and Anatomic and Forensic Pathology. He received medical training at the Geneva University Medical School in Switzerland and the Hebrew University Hadassah Medical School in Jerusalem, Israel. He is the author of 96 scientific publications. He is the author and editor of the textbook Spitz and Fisher's Medicological Investigation of Death, first published in 1972. Charles C. Thomas, publisher, Springfield, Illinois, currently in its 4th edition. He served on various committees investigating the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, including the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Assassinations. He served as an expert and testified in all level courts across the U.S. and Canada in numerous high-visibility cases, including the Mary Jo Kopechne, Ted Kennedy, Chappaquiddick case, the Preppy murder in New York for the Goldman family and their wrongful death lawsuit against O.J. Simpson, the Jenny Jones trial, the Crown Trusted case in Toronto, Owen Hart's high wire fall during a WWF event, the Phil Spector case in California, and the Casey Anthony trial in Florida. He consulted with the Boulder County Police regarding the John Benet Ramsey case. He's the recipient of numerous awards, including the Dean's Award for Service to the Medical Legal Community and Wayne State University School of Medicine, Award for Distinguished Service to Wayne State University School of Medicine, and awards from Wayne and Macomb County Board of Commissioners for outstanding service to the community. He has also received numerous awards from various police departments and also the FBI. Okay, Dr. Spitz, again, thank you and welcome to being on Fouts Forum. It's a great honor to have you speak with us today. Let's briefly discuss your role in each of these high-profile cases, starting with the Mary Jo Kopechne case with Ted Kennedy.
First of all, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, to invite me to be here. The Mary Jo Kopechne case
involving Ted Kennedy,
which involved Ted Kennedy going over the bridge and getting out of the car and leaving Mary Jo Kopechne to drown. That was not very nice of him. It involves primarily to be able to determine the cause of death of Mary Jo without an autopsy. And it was possible to do that and to convince a big room full of media, reporters of any kind, and television crews and whatever.
Did you testify for the defense or the prosecutor?
No, I testified against the prosecutor of Massachusetts,
Okay.
who erroneously released the body of Mary Jo to the family to bury the remains in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, in the family grave. And once she got to Wilkes-Barre, he wanted the body back because everybody in the country was interested in knowing whether Mary Jo Kopechne was pregnant. And of course, if she was pregnant, then the fingers would all have pointed at Ted Kennedy. And to tell you the truth, at that time, there was no test to determine who the father was because there was no DNA. Consequently,
Oh, I remember. Was Mary Jo pregnant?
no, well, I don't think she was, but I don't really know whether she was or wasn't.
Because you didn't do a test.
I didn't do a test, and I didn't care whether she was pregnant. The question to me was, what did she die of? And I testified she drowned and gave reasons why. And that was the end of that. Many people liked the testimony. Some people did not, and called my office and said to me, how much did they pay you for this testimony?
Did you have anything to say or do with the Kennedys or with the Kopechniks, or neither?
Well, I testified there in Wilkes-Barre at that time on behalf of the family of Mary Jo Kopechne, who was trying to prevent the Attorney General of Massachusetts of getting the body back and doing an autopsy on her. They didn't want it, and I didn't really see a reason for doing it.
Two quick questions. What was the reason why you were there? Who asked you to testify?
The attorneys for the family.
And number two, was your testimony favorable to Kennedy or to Mary Jo Kopechne's family, or neither?
The testimony was primarily good for the family of Mary Jo Kopechne, who tried to prevent the body to be retrieved and go back to Massachusetts.
Okay. Would you conclude by everything you knew that this was an accident in which Senator Kennedy was innocent, or would you say that remains to be determined as of today?
No,
He was acquitted, right? Pretty much.
No, he was never acquitted. There never was a trial. There never was anything done, which I am very surprised that happened. He left her to drown and escaped himself, did not go to the police until the next day when the alcohol that he had on board dissipated.
So it just remains...
This was not a very complimentary case in the Kennedy family.
All right, let's move on to the O.J. Simpson case. Briefly, what can you...
The O.J. Simpson case...
Were you hired by who and what? In
the O.J. Simpson case, I testified in court in the civil trial, not the criminal trial. In the criminal trial, I refused to testify because in the criminal trial, Marsha Clark did not tell the truth when she said that she called me, and I refused to go because I was, according to her, afraid of Johnny Cochran's cross-examination. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm not afraid of anybody's cross-examination. So I did not testify for the prosecution in the case of O.J. Simpson because she never called me. Okay. Then the defense called me, and I didn't want to go to testify on behalf of the defense. In the civil trial, I testified on behalf of the Goldman family, who sued O.J. Simpson.
Goldman was the young man who was also murdered, allegedly murdered by Simpson.
He was murdered by O.J. Simpson when he came to the house to bring back Nicole Simpson the glasses that she had left at a dinner party at the Mezzaluna restaurant in Santa Monica.
And succinctly, what was your testimony?
My testimony was how he was able nobody believed that that anybody would be able to kill two people in less than a minute. And I showed the jury how that was possible, and then there was even time left to make up a minute, because it was possible to reenact a killing of two people in much less than 1 minute. And we reenacted that, and the jury agreed, and we won the case.
Let's go to the Phil Spector case. Phil Spector, for those that may not know, was someone who was involved in a lot of classic rock and roll music, and he was a producer, and I can't think of some of the songs, but he was involved in a lot of major rock and roll music.
Phil Spector put to music the Beatles' music, and that's his claim to fame.
He did a lot of other
He did
people.
a lot of other things too, but his main thing was the Beatles, and he was charged, and twice, I believe it was, not acquitted, but with a hung jury.
Now, how did you get involved? Who called you, and what
I was
did you
called
say?
by the defense to defend him for allegedly shooting a lady that he picked up, she was the maitre d' in the House of Blues in Los Angeles. And he picked her up there and took her to his house. And apparently, or that's what the allegation was,
Shot her?
the claim was that he shot her in the mouth. And there's plenty of reason to believe that that may be an exaggerated charge. So I still am convinced that it is absolutely uncertain whether he actually shot her in the mouth himself, or whether she shot herself in the mouth while playing around with the gun. He got convicted eventually, after I think 3 trials, and got 18 years in jail, and he's in jail now.
All right, how about the John Benet Ramsey case? We've all heard about that.
Yes, the John Benet Ramsey case, I did not really testify in trial because there was no trial. There was never a charge against anybody, but recently it came out that the grand jury found that it was an in-house murder. And I have claimed for a long time, or since my involvement, that it was an in-house murder, and I continue to believe that. The family behaved to me personally, in a very suspicious way, in that they never let me into the house and they did not cooperate with me in any way. I did not really testify there in any trial, but I consulted fairly extensively with the police, with the Boulder, Colorado Police Department, so much so that I even went to their offices and spoke to them extensively. And they came here like 2 or 3 times to talk to me about it.
Your conclusion would be what? That she was killed by somebody in the family, or remains to be determined?
No, she was killed by somebody in the house. Who in the house, I don't know. But my opinion was and is that she was killed by somebody in the house, but she has several causes of death. One of them is that she was hit on the head with a flashlight. The flashlight was never examined. None of this was done very professionally. None of the people who were involved with this, including prosecutors, police, anybody who had anything to do with that case, is no longer there. Does not anymore work on it. The Attorney General is not there, who runs the show, not there anymore. No one is now available to continue the mission of the determination of who the actual murderer was. And unfortunately, this continues to be that way.
All right, what about Martin Luther King assassination?
Martin Luther King was very easy, because Martin Luther King, the House of Assassination Committee, looked into that because he had some pattern of scratches on his face that some people thought may be an indication of close-range discharge of a firearm with gunpowder spattered over his face. But it turned out that he fell, and when he collapsed, and face down and got sand imprinted in his skin. And that is what people thought, erroneously, that may be gunpowder, but it was not.
Now let's turn to the assassination of President Kennedy 50 years ago, which of course is our reason for being here today. Let's start out with a simple question. Where were you when you learned of the assassination?
I came to the United States on a visitor's visa, and was, as a result of that, when I tried to immigrate here and stay here permanently, the government said you have to leave the country for 2 years and then reapply for a permit to enter as a permanent visitor or a citizen of the United States, and with a green card, and which then would be converted to citizenship after 5 years. And I was on a ship coming back from Germany, where I had stayed for 2 years and 3 months to comply with that requirement. And when I came back on the 22nd of November, 1963, news came that the president had been shot. And everybody on the ship, in small groups, congregated on the decks of the boat, of the ship, to listen to radio broadcasts out of New York that were received on the ship via shortwave radios. And we listened very intently to find out what goes on and how this is going to affect everybody worldwide. And there were like 2,000 people or 1,500 people on the ship, and they were all on the decks listening to these broadcasts. Well, the next day I arrived in New York on the 23rd, and little did I know that in 1975, 12 years later, I would get a call from an attorney who worked for the vice president, Nelson Rockefeller. This attorney called me and said, would I agree to analyze the circumstances of the shooting of President Kennedy and report to the vice president in a document that I would issue what my opinions are after examination of all the evidence that I may want to examine. Anything that they have, they put at my disposal, including the most horrible-looking, beautiful quality, but so graphic, the pictures of the president on the autopsy table. And I did that, and I reported to the vice president that, in my opinion, this was a sole shooter shooting from the 6th floor of the Texas Book Depository. And from there, he shot the first time and hit the president's right shoulder in the back, and that bullet came out and did not enter, but came out from the neck. The original pathologist that did the autopsy, this was his first and only autopsy on a gunshot victim. He had never done that before. At that time, forensic pathology in America was in its infancy. This death of President Kennedy started that to germinate the science of forensic pathology and how important it is. The pathologist who did the autopsy did not recognize that the bullet wound in the neck was an exit wound, not an entrance wound. Consequently, the president was not shot in a crossfire, but was shot from the back only, from the 6th floor of the book depository. And the bullet wound of exit in the neck looked like an entrance bullet wound because it had an abrasion, a scraping all the way around, like a bullet wound of entrance, and that is an exit with a scraping, because as the skin was moved outward by the bullet, as it exited, scraped on the necktie and the shirt of the president.
Dr. Spitz, I'm going to ask you to do a PowerPoint presentation on the Kennedy assassination. Following that, I will then have some questions about what you concluded in your work with the two committees. So we'll follow up with questions after your PowerPoint.
Well, you can see here is the route that the president's motorcade took in Dallas on that terrible day.
Now, it looks like, if I can just ask you a question, it looks like that would be a route that would lead to a freeway or expressway. Is that right?
That route would lead to the Stebbins Expressway, and you will hear more of that in a minute. And you see the Texas Book Depository is labeled as Texas Book Depository, I think. Yes, it is. Yeah. And from the last window on the right side of the building on the 6th floor is where the shooting came from. Right in the curve where the motorcade would slow down some. And not that it went fast anywhere else, but it went slow already, but then it would go a little bit slower yet. And then the president reaches in his car. Note the total lack of security, with people standing so close to the limousine, and the president sitting in his convertible car, and next to him, to the left, is Jacqueline, and in front of him on the jump seat is Governor Connolly of Texas, and next to him on the next jump seat is his wife, and in the front is, of course, a driver on the left and a Secret Service agent on the right. And the president is approaching approaching a sign in this road saying Stebbins Freeway ahead, and he's waving to the public, and you can see him raise his hand and wave to the public as he's going along. And on the right side of the screen is the edge of the sign that he is just about ready to enter, behind of which he's entering, and he is still waving. Now the president continues to move behind the sign, and he is behind the sign. You only see the top of his head. You see Jacqueline with her whitish or pinkish hat next to him, and he is being driven across that sign to frame 225 on the Zapruder film, and he is now coming out from behind the sign. You can see the far end of the sign on the left of the frame.
Now he's clutching his...
He is clutching his neck. This is frame number 225. He is clutching his neck for the simple reason that the bleeding that has been created as a result of the shot in the shoulder, which came out from the neck into the airway, closed the airway somewhat, and he did not get enough air to breathe.
So he's clutching to try to open up his shirt.
He tried to do
or...
anything that is necessary to open his airway. He just could not breathe. That's a typical reaction.
So he's still alive at this point.
He is alive at this point. Yeah. And
so this is the first shot.
This is the first shot.
Can I ask one question related to your presentation? And this is what was said in the news recently, that he wore a back brace because he had a bad back. So if he had not had the back brace, when the second shot came, he's sitting up here, he might have fallen forward, and that could have saved his life.
That's correct.
So that was a fateful decision to have the back brace.
That is totally correct. If he would have bent forward like I'm doing, like
and
that,
then
that would have shielded the top of his head. And he would have never been shot. Or if somebody like one of the Secret Service people would have lied on top of him, that would have eliminated that possibility altogether.
Because they could have saved his life.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Security-wise, this was zero. The next picture shows the shot in the back of the head, where you can see the streaks going away from Kennedy's head up in the air. And you can see them, the white streaks of bone and skin and blood and whatever it was, tissue, flying off his head. And of course, at that moment, at that very instant,
That was when he was killed.
that is when he became brain dead, at that moment, that very moment. The driver now realized that he is being, that they are being shot at. Nobody knew from where, nobody knew how, nobody knew who, nobody knew anything other than disaster is looming. And he pushed his foot on the accelerator, and Kennedy went flying back, as he would, from the sudden acceleration to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where he arrived in dire condition, and a surgeon in the emergency room made a cut right through the bullet wound of exit in the neck, making it more difficult, but not for an experienced forensic pathologist, to look at this altered, quote-unquote, altered bullet wound of exit, to make it more difficult to recognize that this is an exit, not an entrance.
Could I ask you to go back to this frame? Could you point out to the audience Governor Connally?
Governor Connally is sitting immediately in front of the president on a jump seat. And Governor Connally, when Kennedy was hit in the back of the right shoulder, and the bullet exited from his neck, that bullet went into Governor Connally's back on the right side and exited from that chest and went into his wrist and then into his thigh. Many people said, no, that is not possible. That bullet that would have been disintegrated, would never remain pristine. The bullet did not remain pristine. That is a media fiction. I held the bullet in my hand. There you will see a picture that I will show you of the bullet, and you will judge for yourselves that whether this bullet is pristine or not. It is not pristine. It is squeezed, and lead fragments from that bullet distributed in the neck area and were instrumental in indicating the direction of the shot, because when a bullet sheds lead, it sheds it as it goes when it hits bone. And it hit a little bone in the neck and spread some lead. And we know from there how the direction and which direction was implicated here. So the importance of this neck wound being an exit is because there was a claim, and there still is a claim by many people who think that this is in the neck is an entrance bullet wound, because if it were an entrance bullet wound, then it is of course evident that Kennedy was caught in a crossfire, one from the back causing the entrance wound here, one from the front causing the entrance wound here. But when I went to see, before I went to Washington, to the United States Archives to see the evidence, when I was testifying for the government, I asked Dr. Hume, who was the pathologist eventually, after everything was said and done years later, he became the pathologist almost walking distance from my house in Grosse Pointe Shores. And I went there to the pathology department. He was head of pathology at St. John Hospital. I went to them and said, Jim, why did you call this wound in the neck an entrance wound? And he explained to me. And I said, but if it was an entrance wound, wouldn't it behoove you to say, well, entrance wound, where is the bullet? Or the exit wound? And this one is also an entrance wound. So where are two bullets? Didn't you look to see? And he said, you are right. And he became very emotional, very upset, and said, "I'm sorry." Messed it up. To the point where, to this day, people are still thinking that the government lied to them, that actually there was a Castro or there was a Khrushchev or something in Russia, or there was a mob that paid the bill for this execution. There is the shot in the head. You see the streaks that radiate from the exit wound, the entrance wound being in the back of the head.
How big of a chunk of the brain or?
It's not that there was so much tissue missing, but it was that it remained attached but opened, and a lot of brain and some bone was just thrown out. You realize that there are a lot of people who made a lot of to-do about the fact that the president's brain was never examined. The president's brain was suddenly missing. I know, or I think I know, why it was missing and how it is missing.
That was a question that I have always...
Yes. And there is an explanation for that. I don't know if that happened, but I think it happened because it happened where I worked in Baltimore, where I worked in Detroit, where I worked anywhere else. It always happened the same way. So why didn't it happen here? President or no president? When pathologists do autopsies, they put, when there's injury especially to the brain swells. You cannot cut it in the fresh state, because if you do, you're destroying it. Therefore, it must be hardened before. So it is hardened by putting it in a bucket with formaldehyde. And then it is placed against the wall with all the other brains that are waiting for the same thing to harden and to be examined in 7 to 10 days. And then, many times, there's a day or 2 days when there is more than 1 or 2 bodies to examine. There's like 7 or 8 people, sometimes more than that. And brains accumulate put them against the wall. Where else can you put them? Out of the way against the wall. And then after 7 to 10 days, you cut them and take out little pieces to examine in a microscope. But that didn't happen here because somebody threw out a bunch of brains because there was no more room against the wall. That brain is gone. No one stole it. No one took it home. No one put it on the coffee table. No one played games. The brain was removed and destroyed like all the other brains that so often are missing. You say, well, I took the brain out. Where is it? Well, the orderly in the autopsy room had to make a space for new brains to come, and so he threw away those that he thought were too old to be examined.
That is hard to believe that they wouldn't have labeled the bucket with the president's brain, isn't it?
They probably labeled it with a number. When the number is big and strong on the outside of the bucket, but it doesn't say Kennedy.
But, you know, it's hard to believe they wouldn't have, you know,
I know.
That was back then.
But this whole case was, excuse me, but botched.
It was botched.
This whole
badly.
case was botched. So is there a reason to believe that the brain was not innocently discarded? Innocently, stupidly. But it was discarded, not stolen. Like they said, they asked me many times, well, why didn't Ted Kennedy take it? Like we think he stole it and he put it in his basement. He did not take it. What was he going to do with it? Listen, they examined Einstein's brain. His brain doesn't look any different than any crook that was ever executed.
So there would be no practical reason for anybody to take the brain, and it wouldn't lead to anybody's conviction.
No, and nobody came out in the last 50 years and say, here is the President Kennedy's brain and I'm going to auction it. Yeah. Nobody came, nobody did it, nobody. Yeah. It's not there for anybody.
Unfortunately, I could take from you that you're frustrated because all of these botched things encourage the paranoia and the belief by people that the president was killed by some sort of conspiracy, which you don't believe in.
No.
And I will mention that in the Free Press just this week, they said 61% of the American people still believed that it was a conspiracy and it was done by more than one person, which even the Kennedy family have come forward and said this was not a conspiracy, it was done by Lee Harvey Oswald alone.
Yes.
But of course, a lot of people make money by conspiracy
Sure.
theories and conspiracy books,
Sure.
right?
Of course. You have no idea what mounds of books relate to this assassination.
Well, people want to believe that it's something more than one man,
Of course.
because people can't accept that one man,
Can
Lee
do
Harvey
that.
Oswald, could do
And
this.
how did they get that? How could he get that head right in his scope? It's mind-boggling.
But he was a sharpshooter and trained in the Army,
Yes,
right?
he was. And I've got my own personal experiences where I shot a broomstick from a distance of 200 feet, right smack in the middle. So the bullet wound in the head was never shaved because the brass told Hume, who did the autopsy, do not shave the head. And he said, well, I asked him, well, why didn't you shave the wound? So to show where the wound is. You don't see the wound on this picture.
Yeah.
This picture on the left is Kennedy's head as it was in the autopsy room. The hands are gloved by the pathologist holding the head so that the photographer could take a picture. But he did not shave the area.
Now, this is actually an artist sketch, right?
This is an artist sketch of those large pictures in color that
Now, you said you saw large. How big were the color photos?
9 by 12 feet.
Okay.
9 by 12, huge, huge. You could see every pore in the skin of the president.
And would you say these artist sketches are an accurate depiction of what
Oh,
you
yes,
saw? Yeah.
no question about it.
Yeah.
No
now,
question about it.
The right picture is what?
Is the exit. You can see the disruption of the contour of the head on the right side and front of the head. You can see the ear on the right side of the picture. And you can see how disrupted that whole area is. That is because there was an explosion of the front as an exit wound in the head often does.
And again, at that moment when the bullet hit, he was dead.
He was dead. Now then the picture of Jacqueline is trying to get out of the car, and people look at that and say, oh, she was trying to collect his brain, pieces of brain. There probably were pieces of brain there, but she wasn't trying to collect them. She was trying to get out of the line of fire.
I guess Jacqueline testified, you said, that she said she was trying to get out of the car. She was trying
to get out of the vehicle, out of the line of fire.
She was afraid she might be shot.
She might be next, right.
Which is a normal reaction.
Sure, absolutely.
And the Secret Service agent was pushing her back, right?
I don't know if the Secret Service was pushing her back, but the Secret Service man is the one that spread the news in a book that he recently wrote, that she was trying to collect the pieces of brain.
Which is ridiculous.
Which is ridiculous, yes. Another misrepresentation. You can see the wound in the back of the right shoulder. The wound in the back of the right shoulder on the top, on the right side of the index finger of the gloved hand, the top gloved hand on the picture, is the entrance wound in the back. The entrance wound, I guarantee you, did not look like that. That is a representation of the person who drew the picture from those big pictures that I mentioned, and on the bottom is an enlargement of that frame, of that picture in that shows.
Is that accurate, the bottom one?
No, it's wrong, but that's what she saw. That's how her interpretation. It doesn't look like that. I will show you in a minute what it looked like. Here on the top of this frame is a typical entrance bullet wound. How does that look? If I were to describe it to you, a hole in the middle and a scraping, a brown scraping all the way around. Why is that brown scraping? Because if I show you on my handkerchief, and it's a clean handkerchief, assume this is the bullet. If I push the skin, let's say this is skin, I push this down, see how the skin, or in this case the handkerchief, the fabric, bends down inward. As it bends inward, the bullet is scraped on the skin. No matter how smooth the skin, it will scrape the bullet, the skin as the bullet enters. You see how this pushes the skin down. Yeah. The skin does the same because the skin is elastic. And so the skin will go down. As the bullet comes out, it does not scrape the skin, because if it does scrape the skin, it scrapes it on the inside, but you don't see that. Yeah. So as it comes out, it pushes the skin against the clothing, against a tight clothing, like the collar, like when there's a necktie. And as a result of that, you get the scraping from the skin pushing up against the collar. And it scrapes it, and it looks like an entrance bullet wound, except Dr. Hume did not know that. This exit wound was, without any doubt, an exit wound and not an entrance wound. And Dr. Hume, who also made another mistake, he apologized to me for thinking that, as if it matters what he tells me. But he felt so strongly about it, he almost cried. And he said, well, what can I do? I didn't know. And I said, well, why did you do it? Why did you do the whole autopsy? Why didn't you tell them that there's a perfectly wonderful forensic pathologist 45 miles away in Baltimore called Russell Fisher? And there's another forensic pathologist in New York called Milton Halpin. Wonderful people. He says, the brass told me to do it, and when the brass tells you, you do it. You don't ask questions. Dr. Hume, for example, another mistake that he made, he was sitting at home by the fireplace. This was in November. It's cold in Washington. He had the fireplace going. He had during the autopsy, he had gloves on, took notes. As he examined the body, there was some blood on the gloves. He continued to make notes. He came home, wrote it to dictate or write a report. There was blood on the sheets that he was using. He put the sheets in the fire.
Oh, Lord.
There are no notes that Dr. Hume ever made with his own handwriting as to what he saw, how he saw, anything to do with that.
So you could say unwittingly, Dr. Hume...
No, innocently, totally.
Well, innocently.
Yeah.
He contributed, that's why I say unwittingly, to this whole conspiracy theory by the absence...
All this perpetuated that.
So today, you have an industry of people who write books and make movies
yes.
About this conspiracy that never existed.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Let's face it, you sell more books talking about conspiracy than you do saying that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone assassin.
That is, exactly, 61%.
Yeah. This conspiracy theory will never go away. It'll
this
always
will never
be there.
die.
Kennedy
died, but this conspiracy...
This outlives the president and
exactly.
even all the good deeds that this
Directly.
president did.
They are still talking about the assassination of President Lincoln.
Yeah.
Here, this is a picture of the president's wound in the neck when Hume saw it. This is a rendition of the artist that drew this from a color picture.
Now, you say this is an accurate rendition.
This is an accurate rendition, except what it doesn't show is that in the middle of the wound, there was evidence. If you put this wound back together by pushing the edges together, you would have seen on the top and on the bottom, the margin would have been abraded by the exiting bullet, like I told you earlier. And of course, that is not shown because she did not recognize that that is an abrasion. She just thought it's nothing, or maybe an artifact, that person who drew this. So that is what perpetuated. You see, what I'm trying to show you is from the little area of forensic pathology in this case, how many mistakes compounding the examination.
Which perpetuate conspiracy theories.
Yes, and that is where the 61% come from. Here is a guy from Detroit that was shot. That is what they do, the surgeons. They go through this See, this is a regular color picture. He has got a bullet wound in the neck, an exit bullet wound where the surgeon in the ER at Detroit Receiving made a cut right through it. President's neck looked just like that. Here is how the bullet wound of exit is incurred. Now, if you imagine that there is a collar up here, you can see how this skin rubs up against the collar of the and causes the wound to be abraded. Exit bullet wounds with abrasion are not infrequent. This is a woman who was shot with a witness standing around looking. You can see that the bullet wound of exit, this is the bullet wound of exit. The bullet wound of entrance is in the front. You can see that the bullet wound of exit comes out at the band of the brassiere. You can see the abrasion all the way around the bullet wound. We talk about the bullet that went into President Kennedy's back and came out the neck, went into Governor Connolly's chest, came out the front, went into Governor Connolly's wrist, came out from the wrist, and grazed, did not break, but just grazed the thigh bone, or the left thigh bone of the governor, and then landed on the floor of the limousine. And they say, that's impossible, it cannot, a bullet that goes through all these bones could never be pristine. And they bring a picture to bear on that explanation. And the pictures on the upper picture, you see that picture is shows a bullet that is indeed pristine. That is the actual bullet. Now, on the lower picture, you can see the same bullet, but it shows the base of the bullet. And you can see that it is not perfectly round. Mm-hmm. And you can see that there's lead missing from the base. Where is that lead? In Kennedy's neck.
Thank you, Dr. Spitz, for your presentation. I'd like to have some follow-up. You probably already answered some of my questions, but I think it's worth reviewing them a little bit. This was a devastating loss to our nation because not only was John Kennedy the youngest president, the first president born in that century, but he was also the first Catholic president, the first World War II president, and he was a leader that inspired a lot of people, particularly young people of my generation, to serve unselfishly for the government. The wounds, just summary again, the wounds revealed what?
The wounds revealed a bullet wound in the back of the right shoulder. That bullet came out from the neck. That bullet went through Governor Connolly's chest, his wrist, and the wrist and the chest barely have any real bony tissue. Yes, it's bone, but it's very thin bone. It's mostly marrow cavity. And the thigh, just soft tissue, not, it grazed over the bone. It didn't even really hit the bone. Could that have generated a bullet that is as little deformed as this so-called pristine bullet? Of course it could. Those bullets have very, very tough jackets, does not deform easily. The deformity of this bullet is totally consistent with that wound track. And then he had the bullet wound in the head, and that killed him instantly.
And I was going to ask you, how serious was the first bullet? And I think we can conclude, correct me if I'm wrong, based on your presentation, I conclude, as was a radio report, that had Kennedy not been wearing this corset or back brace, the first wound might have caused him to fall forward, and he probably would have survived that wound had it not been for the fatal deadly wound. So we can say that history could have been changed. A, had the Secret Service pushed him to wear a top over the car. He didn't want a top over the car. And secondly, had he not been wearing this back brace or corset, he probably would still be, maybe not alive today, because if President Kennedy were alive today, he'd be 96, he'd be turning 97 in May. But history could have been changed had those two things been different, right?
Well, he wouldn't be dead.
He wouldn't be dead today. No. What is your take on Jackie Kennedy's actions after President Kennedy was shot?
She did what any normal person would do, try to get out of the line of fire.
Am I right in assuming that the autopsy was botched because of mistakes by the pathologists.
Not only the pathologists, everybody made misinterpretations based on their own vision of what they think might have happened.
You said that Texas had a forensic pathologist, but the Secret Service did injury to him, causing someone else. You want to explain that again?
Dr. Earl Rhodes was the medical examiner for Dallas County.
At the time,
a forensic pathologist, board certified, a well-known forensic pathologist, prominent member in the American Academy of Forensic Science. He stood in the way and said, you cannot take, when the Secret Service won't take the body, he stood in the way and said, no dice, I am in charge here, and you cannot take the body under Texas state law. And he will do with the body what he has to do. And what he was going to do is do a proficient autopsy.
A forensic
autopsy.
And what did the Secret Service do? Or
the Secret Service or the FBI, I'm not sure which, pushed him aside, and he fell against the edge of a table, injured his back severely, took the body and put it in Air Force One, and flew the plane to Washington, and the autopsy was done in the Naval Hospital, which is in Bethesda, Maryland.
Which was botched up.
That autopsy was botched up. It wouldn't have been botched up.
So indirectly, the Secret Service or FBI sort of caused the botched up situation.
You are correct.
And caused all these crazy conspiracy
You
theories.
are totally correct. Gave the opportunity, laid the foundation for a conspiracy theory.
What would you like to share as an expert on the Kennedy assassination? What would you summarize, or what would you say for anybody who looks at this in the future?
The percentage of people who believe that this is a conspiracy is probably very gradually going down to a little bit, somewhat. What we've learned from this, well, the profession of forensic pathology is the one who saw a growth of interest in forensic pathology after the assassination. Every few days we get a call from somebody, he wants to work in forensic. Well, what do you want to do in forensic? You have to be a doctor, and then you have to do a residency in pathology and forensic pathology and all this, and then you're only a beginner. Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that. I don't want to do that. Well, that you asked about it, we're giving you the scoop.
Of all the cases you've worked on, including the Kennedy assassination case, what one fascinates you the most, and what one causes you to continue to think and reflect on?
Well, the Kennedy assassination caused that to me, but when a person is on the autopsy table, he can be the pauper, panhandler, or he can be the president. It's all the same.
I note that you continue to practice, even though you've been practicing for 50 years. Can I assume that your sharpness and quickness and vigor is due to the fact that you have a belief, as I do, that there is no such thing as retirement? You continue to work and be vigorous. Is that?
You're so right. I gave a talk on that issue. They were all older people, and I hope that they're doing what they said they would be doing when I left. I convinced them that retiring is not good.
I agree with that. And on that, I thank you, and I hope to see you in 20 years when we can again resume and look over the Kennedy assassination again, because I know you will be around 20 years from now. I hope I am, and I'll toast that you will be, so I will be too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
A great and fascinating presentation.
With a pleasure.
And again, with some degree of sadness, we commemorate this discussion on the tragic events that led to the death of John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, on November 22nd, 1963, a date which will live in our memory of those of us who were there forever. Thank you until another Fouts Forum.